Something is happening in Cleveland, and if you blink, you're going to miss it entirely. While every other front office in the AFC was throwing money at free agents like confetti at a parade, the Browns were silent. Eerily, deliberately, almost suspiciously silent. Andrew Berry sat back, watched the chaos unfold across the league, and didn't flinch. Not one veteran wide receiver signed. Not one draft pick burned on a pass catcher. In a league where standing still usually means falling behind, Cleveland chose stillness, and that should terrify every defensive coordinator in the NFL. Because here's what I know about hunters. The patient ones are always the most dangerous. This isn't a team that forgot to address its roster. This is a front office holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to strike. And everything we're seeing right now, the cap space, the roster vacancy, the quiet, it all points to one inevitable conclusion. The Browns are coming for a blockbuster trade in 2026, and the names being floated are not role players. We're talking about the kind of receivers that change the identity of a franchise overnight. So let's get into it because this story is moving fast and the landscape is shifting by the hour. Start with the name that's broken the internet more times in the last few weeks than any other player in the league. A.J. Brown. Now, before you roll your eyes and say you've heard this one before, hear me out, because the smoke coming out of Philadelphia right now is not normal smoke. This is the kind of thick, billowing, can't ignore it smoke that usually means the building is actually on fire. The top insiders in this league are no longer treating an A.J. Brown departure from the Eagles as a hypothetical. They're treating it as a matter of when, not if. And what's making this particularly fascinating is that it reportedly isn't just Philadelphia pushing him out the door. It's about what the player himself wants. When a receiver of that magnitude starts having preferences about his future destination, the trade market doesn't just open up, it explodes. Now, the Browns are being connected to Brown, and yes, I understand how that sentence sounds, through a deal centered around the 24th overall pick. Think about what that actually means. You are looking at a proven, elite, top 5 receiver in the entire NFL, a guy who goes up and body bags cornerbacks for breakfast, and the conversation is whether a late first-round rookie is an equal return. The answer almost certainly is no. A.J. Brown is not a late first-round pick. He is a game wrecker in his prime. The salary cap math does get complicated here. If Philadelphia moves him before June 1st, they swallow somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 million in dead cap. That's a painful pill. But here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Even absorbing that hit, the Eagles would still come out of the deal with more flexibility than they had walking into free agency. Howie Roseman is one of the sharpest cap manipulators this league has ever seen. If he decides a post-June trade maximizes his flexibility, he pulls that trigger without hesitation. And there's one more variable that just got thrown into this equation. The Jalen Waddle trade reset the market for elite wide receivers in a dramatic way. If Waddle commands a first-round pick and additional capital, then what is A.J. Brown worth? The price just went up. Possibly way up. The window to get this deal done cheaply is closing faster than people realize, and Andrew Berry knows it. But A.J. Brown isn't the only name on the board, and honestly, the next one might be even more intriguing from a pure story perspective. Marvin Harrison Jr. Let that name sit with you for a second. A 4th overall pick. An Ohio State legend. A receiver with arguably the most decorated last name in the history of the position. And right now, he's sitting in Arizona in what can only be described as a complete mess. Cardinals fans aren't just frustrated, they're in open revolt. The production hasn't come close to matching the expectations that come with being a top 5 pick, and the bust conversation has started circling far too early in his career. This is where Andrew Berry earns his salary. Do you buy low on generational bloodlines, elite athleticism, and a player who hasn't even scratched the surface of what he can become? Because here's the thing that gets overlooked in all the Harrison Jr. criticism. He dealt with nagging injuries all year. And despite that, he was still the guy drawing double coverage while his teammates soaked up stats in single coverage. He cooked elite corners when he was healthy. He showed flashes of exactly why teams fell in love with him coming out of college. The idea of Marvin Harrison Jr. coming home to Ohio, playing in Cleveland on a rookie deal as the unquestioned number 1 receiver, is the kind of move that shifts a franchise's entire identity. If the Cardinals are genuinely ready to cut their losses, Berry needs to be first in line with an offer. The value play here is almost too obvious to ignore. Now, if you want to talk about a player who absolutely should not be available but might be anyway, we need to have an honest conversation about Jordan Addison in Minnesota. Addison is the kind of player that, in a vacuum, you build your offense around. On the field, he is a legitimate weapon, a guy who would immediately be the top receiver on half the rosters in this league. But the situation surrounding him in Minnesota has gone from complicated to genuinely toxic. The Vikings are staring down one of the largest contracts in NFL history to lock up Justin Jefferson long-term. The math for paying two elite receivers simply doesn't work. But it's not just money. Addison's off-field record has become a growing list of serious red flags, repeated issues with law enforcement, missing team activities, conduct that doesn't fit inside the culture a contending organization needs to maintain. The Vikings have reportedly reached the point where they might accept a second-round pick just to move on cleanly. A second-round pick for a player with WR1 ability. If that's real, that is one of the most aggressive value propositions in this entire trade market. You keep your first-round picks to build the trenches, you protect your quarterback, and you slide in a high-octane playmaker at a fraction of the cost. The question for Cleveland isn't whether Addison has talent. He clearly does. The question is whether this locker room has the leadership infrastructure to absorb that kind of distraction and get the best out of him anyway. That's the real calculus. Speaking of character risk, let's talk about Rashee Rice and the situation developing in Kansas City, because this one has some real intrigue attached to it. Rice stepped up when Mahomes needed him last season. Nearly 600 yards, 5 touchdowns. As a young player still learning the position, those are legitimate numbers. The Chiefs clearly have a real player on their hands. But Kansas City is a championship organization, and championship organizations have very little tolerance for the kind of off-field noise that has started surrounding Rice. When you are in a win-now culture with a Hall of Fame quarterback, every roster spot and every locker room dynamic matters. The Chiefs are reportedly approaching the end of their patience. If Kansas City decides to move him, his value will have dropped dramatically because of his personal decisions, not because of anything that happens between the white lines. And that's where a sharp front office finds an edge. We could be talking about a 25-year-old with legitimate upside available for a third-round pick or potentially even less. Andrew Berry built his reputation on exactly this kind of move, finding the player whose market value has been artificially depressed and betting on the football ability outlasting the baggage. Now, not every move has to be a calculated risk on a complicated personality. Brian Thomas Jr. down in Jacksonville represents the cleaner, more conventional blockbuster option. Teams have been lighting up the Jaguars' phones, and while Jacksonville keeps insisting he's part of their long-term plan, we've seen franchises in rebuild mode say that before. Everyone in the NFL has a price. The Jags are reportedly asking for a first-round pick, and honestly, after a somewhat quiet year for Thomas, that price feels steep. But in a market this aggressive, stranger things have happened. And then there's the tier underneath all of this, the players who don't make headlines but might actually be the smartest moves of the entire offseason. Quentin Johnston in Los Angeles was a first-round pick whose development has stalled with the Chargers. The talent that made him draftable hasn't gone anywhere, just the opportunity. Keon Coleman in Buffalo is somehow available after the Bills invested a draft pick in him and appear to have already moved on, which tells you everything you need to know about the dysfunction in that front office right now. Even Dantavian Wicks out of Green Bay deserves a look. The Packers run what is essentially a wide receiver factory, and when players get crowded out of that system, they often go on to have real careers elsewhere. Wicks is reliable, he's consistent, and he'd cost a fraction of what any of the names at the top of this list would demand. But here's the thing I keep coming back to when I look at all of this from 30,000 feet. Andrew Berry didn't leave this roster the way it is by accident. He didn't watch the rest of the league spend freely and simply forget that his team needed a receiver. He made a choice. He preserved cap space. He kept picks on the board. He watched and waited while the market defined itself around him. That is the behavior of a man who has already identified his target. That is the behavior of a front office that knows something the rest of us are still piecing together from rumors and smoke signals. The Browns are not in a rebuilding cycle. This team is in a win-now window, and that changes everything about how you approach a trade. You don't get to wait 3 years for a rookie to figure out how to run a route at the NFL level. You need a player who walks in on day one and immediately makes your offense harder to defend. You need someone who pulls safeties into the box, who commands double coverage, who forces defensive coordinators to change their entire game plan just because his name is on the depth chart. That player exists. Several of them, in fact, are becoming available right now, at prices that may never be this reasonable again. Whether it's A.J. Brown bringing his physicality and veteran command to this offense, Marvin Harrison Jr. completing a homecoming story that writes itself, or a calculated swing on a high-ceiling talent at a discounted price, a move is coming out of Cleveland. The front office has been too quiet, too deliberate, and too calculated for this to end with nothing. If you want to be locked in when it happens, the moment Barry pulls the trigger and changes this franchise, make sure you're subscribed to Brown's Breakout, hit that like button, and turn on your notifications because when this deal drops, we are going to be all over it before anyone else. The board is set. The pieces are moving. Cleveland is hunting. And I genuinely cannot wait for the moment this all comes together.